Well, welcome to another class on men and women of the Old Testament. We've been studying this now for the last several classes, and we've talked so far about Adam and Eve and Noah. And today we're talking about Abraham. Abraham. Now, I want to start with the land of Ur, and that's spelled U-R, and it was located in Mesopotamia. If you look at Acts chapter 7, beginning in verse number 2, the Bible says, "And he said, Brethren and fathers, listen. The glory of God appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, Get out of your country and from your relatives and come to a land that I will show you. And then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he moved him to this land in which you now dwell." And so the land of Ur was located in Mesopotamia. From Ur, Abraham, as we just read, went on to Haran. He went on to Haran, and there was a promise made to Abraham, I should say. And I want us to look at that promise for just a moment. And let's go over to Genesis chapter 12, and let's begin with verses 1 and 2. I want to look at God's promise to Abraham. The Bible says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram," this is before he's known as Abraham, but the Lord said to Abram, "Get out of your country from now, or from your family and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." The first thing that God promises Abraham is a land. He says, "I'm going to get you a land that I'm going to show you." The second thing he promises him was a nation. He promises him a nation of people, and that is the Hebrew people, God's chosen people. Amos 3 and verse 2. The citizenship was by birth. The old law was given only to the Hebrew nation, and this would be the nation through whom Christ would come. Now, as far as that land is concerned, the Bible tells us that at the time of the land promise, God did not tell Abraham where that land was located. But later we would find out, and he would as well, that it was the land of Canaan. And finally, the third thing that he promised him was a blessing. It was a promise to bless those who blessed Abraham, a promise to curse those who cursed Abraham, and he promised that through his descendants, the Messiah, Christ, would bring a blessing to all nations and peoples. And even though Abraham did not know where he was going, he obeyed God. And this was counted to him for righteousness. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6, and Romans chapter 4. Abraham is often spoken of in a very high esteem and very high regard because of his obedience to the Lord. As we move on to the next part of our study, let's look at Abraham's family. Abraham's family. You know, Abraham truly expressed what it meant to walk by faith, Hebrews 11, verses 8 and 9. And he had two sons. His oldest sons that it would be are Ishmael, who was born of Hagar, and Isaac, who was born of Sarah. And Sarah conceived at 90 years of age and was a woman of faith. Romans 4 and verse 19. But there is a trial of Abraham's faith. You see, God had promised Abraham for a long time that he was going to have a son. And for a long period of time, it did not come to pass. And so Abraham took matters into his own hands, and Ishmael was born. But you see, Ishmael, Hagar's son, was not the son of promise. Isaac was. And so in Genesis chapter 22, the Bible tells us that God tests Abraham. And I want to notice these verses here. Genesis 22, beginning in verse 1. "Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And then he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." Stop for just a moment and ask yourself a serious question. What would you say? How would you respond? This is the son that God has promised you for years, and he's finally here. And now you're told to kill him? We talk a lot about the mindset and the problems of our country and the problems of the church and the problems of the individual families, and you fill in the blanks with whatever you're thinking about. But can you imagine being told by God to kill your only son, the son that God had promised. And yet, what does verse 3 tell us? Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. And then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place far off. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." So Abraham that took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham and said, "My father." "Here I am, my son." So look, the fire and the wood, we've got these, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." And the 2 of them went together. And then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Now stop for a moment and put yourself in Isaac's shoes. Do we really think that it would be easy for us to sit there and just let ourselves be laid down onto a burnt offering, a pile of wood that is intended for us to be killed? And Abraham stretched out his hand and took a knife and was ready to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." And what happens? Well, the Bible tells us that the trial that put him to the ultimate test, that God stayed his hand as he was about to take his son's life as the directed offering. The angel called to him twice, "Abraham, Abraham, stop, don't do this." And Abraham heard God to the point of a willingness to offer his only son, the son he was promised. That is obedience, isn't it? That is a love and understanding of God and his word and his commandments, and knowing that God would find some way to see you through. You see, I didn't take you to here earlier, but I want to take you to the book of Hebrews for a quick moment. And I want us to look at chapter 11 and verses 8 and 9, where the Bible tells us, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place in which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. And he waited for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And then we jump down to verse 17, and it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding what? Verse 19, that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. At this point in time, what scriptures do we have that tell us that resurrections from the dead were an everyday occurrence, or were even an ability to happen? See, we don't have anything like that. There's nothing that tells us that someone could be risen from the dead. But Abraham concluded that if God made him a seed of promise, that son, Isaac, would bless the nations, and that Abraham would be blessed by that nation, that God's not actually going to let him stay dead. And that's why he was willing to offer him. What an example we can find about Abraham. Now, Abraham was not a perfect man. We know that he told a lie and acted as if his wife Sarah was his sister on one occasion, and tried to prevent her from being taken. And in fact, he got into a lot of trouble for that. And so we know that Abraham was not a perfect man. Very few are, only one that we know of. But Abraham lived a good life. He's in the Hall of Faith for a reason. Now, as we go through our cards today, we only have about 4 to go through. We're going to look at card number 13 first, which asks the question, who was called by God at Ur? Well, that was Abraham. Acts chapter 7, verses 2 through 4. We read that earlier. Card number 14, God promised Abraham what? Well, he promised him land, nation, and a blessing. A land, nation, and a blessing, and all of those things did come to pass. Card number 15, by faith, Abraham obeyed what? Well, he obeyed God. That's not a what, it's a who. He obeyed God. Card number 16, the mother of Ishmael and Isaac. Well, the mother of Ishmael was Hagar, and who was Sarah's handmaiden. And that's Genesis 16 and verse 15. And then Isaac was born to Sarah, Genesis 21, verses 1 through 8. And card number 17, what was the test of Abraham's faith? It was a sacrifice of Isaac, Genesis 22, 1 through 19. You know, the life of Abraham, as we studied it together and we've looked at it and we've tried to ponder upon it, is a life that we could all do well in imitating the obedience that he had to God. When God said to leave his home, he left. When God said to wait for a son of promise, didn't wait all the way, but he waited and waited and finally was blessed with that son of promise. And when God told him to take that son and to kill him, Abraham said, if God's going to kill my son, he must be intending to raise him from the dead. I'm thankful that you've decided to study through this quarter with me and look through these men and women of the Old Testament. I pray that the study has been efficient to you and sufficient and has been beneficial, I guess is what I'm looking for, that word. And I hope and pray that you'll join us again for the next week when we talk about Jacob. But until then, have a great day.